Welcome everyone. Today we are going to explore one of the most important inventions in human history. This invention changed how people learned, how they shared ideas, and how they understood the world. It happened over 500 years ago, but we still feel its effects every single day. Imagine a world without books. Imagine a world where only the very rich could own a single book. Imagine spending your entire life savings just to buy one Bible. This was the reality for most people in the year 1440. Let me take you to the city of Mainz, Germany. The year is 1440. The streets are narrow and muddy. Wooden houses lean against each other like tired old friends. The air smells of smoke from cooking fires and the leather workshops that line the river. In one of these workshops, a man named Johannes Gutenberg is having trouble sleeping. He has an idea that won't leave him alone. He is not a young man anymore. He is almost 50 years old. Many people would say he has failed at business several times. But Gutenberg has a vision. Before we continue with his story, let's understand the world he lived in. In medieval Europe, books were incredibly rare and valuable. Monks in monasteries copied books by hand. They sat in cold rooms called scriptoriums, writing carefully with quill pens and ink they made themselves. One book could take months or even years to complete. A single Bible might require the skins of 300 sheep for the pages. The work was slow, painful, and expensive. Only churches, universities, and the very wealthy could afford to own books. This meant that knowledge was controlled by a very small group of people. Most people could not read. Even if they could read, they had no access to books. The church and the nobility decided what information people could have. This gave them enormous power over ordinary citizens. But Gutenberg had seen something interesting. He had watched workers making wine. They used a large press to squeeze grapes. The press pushed down with tremendous force. Gutenberg thought, what if we could use a similar press for something else? He had also seen wooden block printing. Craftsmen carved entire pages of text into blocks of wood. Then they covered the wood with ink and pressed paper against it. This was faster than hand copying, but still very slow. Each page needed its own carved block. If you made a mistake, you had to carve the entire block again. Gutenberg's brilliant idea was this. What if individual letters could move? What if you could arrange metal letters in any order, use them to print a page, then rearrange the same letters to print a different page? This was the concept of movable type. The idea sounds simple now. But making it work was incredibly difficult. Gutenberg spent years experimenting. He needed to create metal letters that were all exactly the same height. He needed ink that would stick to metal but not to wood. He needed paper that was strong enough for the press but smooth enough for clear printing. He borrowed money from a wealthy businessman named Johann Fust. The work consumed all his time and money. His workshop became a place of constant experimentation. Metal alloys were tested and rejected. Ink recipes were tried and abandoned. Press designs were built and rebuilt. Imagine the workshop on a cold winter morning in 1450. The room smells of hot metal and oil-based ink. Gutenberg's hands are stained black. His eyes are tired from working by candlelight. But today, something is different. Today, he believes he has solved all the problems. He has created an alloy of lead, tin, and antimony that works perfectly. The letters are sharp and clear. He has developed an oil-based ink that transfers beautifully from metal to paper. His press, adapted from the wine press design, applies exactly the right amount of pressure. Gutenberg carefully arranges the metal letters to form words. His assistants help him lock the type into a wooden frame. They spread ink across the letters with leather balls. They place a sheet of paper on top. Then Gutenberg pulls the heavy wooden handle. The press comes down with a deep, satisfying sound. When they lift the paper, everyone in the workshop holds their breath. There, on the white surface, are clear, black letters. Perfect letters. Identical letters. Beautiful letters. The men look at each other with wide eyes. They know they are seeing something that will change the world. But Gutenberg doesn't want to print just any book. He wants to print the Bible. This is a bold and dangerous choice. The Bible is the most important book in Christian Europe. If his printed Bible looks cheap or contains errors, the church might condemn him. People might call his work blasphemy. Gutenberg decides to make his Bible so beautiful that no one can criticize it. He designs the pages to look like the finest hand-copied manuscripts. He uses 2 columns of text, just like the scribes used. He leaves spaces for artists to add colorful decorations by hand later. The work begins in earnest around 1452. Gutenberg and his team print page after page. The workshop operates like a factory, which is a new concept for making books. Different workers have different jobs. Some arrange the type. Some operate the press. Some hang the wet pages to dry. The smell of ink fills the building. The sound of the press becomes a rhythm that the workers know by heart. Pull the handle, press the paper, lift the press, remove the sheet, hang it to dry. Again and again, day after day, month after month. By 1455, Gutenberg has printed about 180 copies of the Bible. Each one has more than 1,200 pages. This is an astonishing achievement. Before Gutenberg, there were probably only about 30,000 books in all of Europe. He has just added thousands of pages to that total in just a few years. But there is a problem. Gutenberg has spent all his money and all the money he borrowed. Johann Fust, the businessman who lent him money, demands payment. Gutenberg cannot pay. In a heartbreaking legal battle, Fust takes control of the workshop and the printing equipment. Gutenberg loses almost everything. The man who invented the printing press doesn't get to enjoy its success. He dies in 1468, relatively poor and largely forgotten by his neighbors. But his invention has already begun to spread across Europe like wildfire. Other printers see what Gutenberg has done. They copy his methods and improve them. Print shops open in Italy, France, England, and the Netherlands. By 1500, just 50 years after Gutenberg's first Bible, there are more than 20 million books in Europe. Think about that number. From 30,000 to 20 million in half a century. This reminds us that even today, transformative technologies can spread incredibly fast. The Internet went from a military project to a global network in just a few decades. Social media went from college campuses to billions of users in less than 20 years. The pattern Gutenberg started continues. But let's talk about what these books actually did to society. The changes were profound and sometimes dangerous. First, books became affordable. A printed book cost about 1/5 the price of a hand-copied manuscript. Middle-class families could own books. Students could buy textbooks. Merchants could have account books and reference materials. Second, books became standardized. Before printing, every copy of a book was slightly different because human scribes made different mistakes. With printing, every copy of a book was identical. A student in Paris could read exactly the same text as a student in Rome. This allowed scholars across Europe to have precise discussions about texts. Third, and most importantly, printing broke the Church's monopoly on knowledge. For centuries, the Catholic Church had controlled what books were copied and who could read them. Most Bibles were in Latin, which ordinary people didn't understand. Priests told people what the Bible said, and people had to trust them. But now, printers began publishing Bibles in German, English, French, and other languages that common people spoke. For the first time, a farmer or a shopkeeper could read the Bible and interpret it themselves. This was revolutionary and threatening to the Church's authority. Let me tell you about Martin Luther, a German monk who lived about 70 years after Gutenberg. In 1517, Luther wrote a document called the 95 Theses. He criticized the Catholic Church for selling indulgences, which were basically payments that supposedly reduced punishment for sins. Luther thought this was wrong and corrupt. In the Old World, Luther's document might have been read by a few dozen scholars and then forgotten. But this was the new world of printing. Printers made thousands of copies of Luther's 95 Theses. Within 2 weeks, copies had spread across Germany. Within 2 months, they had reached most of Europe. People read Luther's ideas and agreed with him. They began to question the Church's teachings. This led to the Protestant Reformation, one of the most important religious and political movements in European history. The Reformation split Christianity into Catholic and Protestant branches. It led to wars, new nations, and new ways of thinking about faith and authority. Would the Reformation have happened without the printing press? Most historians say no. Luther himself said, "Printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one." The printing press gave Luther's ideas wings. It turned one monk's complaint into a continent-wide revolution. But the printing press didn't just spread religious ideas. It spread scientific knowledge too. In 1543, a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus published a book claiming that the Earth revolves around the Sun, not the other way around. This contradicted what the Church taught and what most people believed. Copernicus's book was printed and distributed across Europe. Other scientists read it. Some agreed, some disagreed, but everyone could examine his evidence and arguments. This is how science progresses, through the free exchange of ideas and evidence. Imagine a young Italian scientist named Galileo Galilei reading Copernicus's book in the late 1500s. Galileo builds a telescope and observes the moons of Jupiter. He sees that these moons orbit Jupiter, not Earth. This supports Copernicus's idea that not everything in the universe revolves around Earth. Galileo writes about his discoveries. His books are printed and spread across Europe. The Church condemns him and puts him under house arrest, but they cannot stop his ideas from spreading. The books are already out there, being read and discussed in universities and coffee houses. This pattern repeated itself over and over. Isaac Newton published his laws of motion and gravity in a printed book in 1687. Scientists everywhere could read his mathematical formulas, test them, and build on them. Knowledge became cumulative. Each generation of scientists could stand on the shoulders of the previous generation because their work was preserved in printed books. The printing press also changed politics. Governments had always controlled information through official announcements and loyal scribes. But with printing presses, independent publishers could print newspapers, pamphlets, and political criticism. People could read different viewpoints and form their own opinions. In the American colonies in the 1770s, printed pamphlets helped unite people against British rule. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in 1776, sold more than 100,000 copies in a few months. It convinced many Americans that independence from Britain was not just possible but necessary. Without the printing press, the American Revolution might never have gained enough popular support to succeed. The same thing happened in France. In the years before the French Revolution of 1789, illegal printing presses produced pamphlets criticizing the king and the aristocracy. These pamphlets spread ideas about equality, liberty, and democracy. They helped create the public anger that eventually overthrew the monarchy. Let's think about education. Before printing, education was available only to the wealthy. Books were too expensive for schools to own many copies. A teacher might have one book and read from it while students tried to memorize what they heard. This was inefficient and limited. With printed books, schools could give each student their own textbook. Students could read at their own pace, review difficult sections, and study at home. This made education much more effective. Literacy rates began to rise. In 1450, perhaps only 10% of Europeans could read. By 1800, in some countries, more than half the population could read. This rise in literacy created a new kind of society. Reading people are thinking people. They can access information independently. They can compare different sources. They can question authority. They can participate in complex discussions about politics, religion, science, and philosophy. The printing press also preserved knowledge in a new way. Before printing, if a monastery burned down, all its hand-copied books might be lost forever. Ancient knowledge disappeared regularly through fires, wars, and accidents. But printed books existed in multiple copies in different locations. If one copy was destroyed, others survived. This is why we still have so many books from the 1500s and 1600s today. They were printed in hundreds or thousands of copies, and some of those copies survived. This preservation of knowledge allowed human civilization to progress faster. We didn't have to keep rediscovering the same truths. Now let's talk about language. Before printing, languages were fluid and regional. People in northern England spoke differently from people in southern England. There was no standard spelling or grammar. But when printers published books, they had to make choices about spelling and grammar. The way they printed words gradually became the standard way. In England, the printers of London, especially William Caxton, who set up England's first printing press in 1476, helped standardize English. The spelling and grammar they used in their books became the model that schools taught. This created a more unified language and culture. The same thing happened in other countries. Printing helped create standard versions of German, French, Spanish, and Italian. These standard languages helped create national identities. People who spoke the same standard language felt connected to each other, even if they lived far apart. This sense of national identity contributed to the formation of modern nation-states. But the printing press also created new problems. Just as it could spread truth, it could spread lies. Just as it could educate, it could mislead. Printers published sensational stories, conspiracy theories, and propaganda. Some books promoted hatred against religious minorities or political opponents. Governments and churches tried to control printing through censorship and licensing. In many countries, you needed official permission to operate a printing press. Banned books were burned. Printers who published forbidden materials were imprisoned or executed. But controlling printing proved difficult. Small illegal presses operated in secret. Banned books were smuggled across borders. This tension between freedom of the press and censorship continues today. We still debate how much freedom publishers, websites, and social media platforms should have. We still worry about misinformation spreading faster than truth. These are not new problems. They began with Gutenberg's invention. Let me take you to a coffee house in London in the year 1700. The room is crowded with men drinking coffee and chocolate, which are exotic new beverages from distant lands. But more importantly, they are reading. Newspapers are scattered on the tables. Pamphlets are passed from hand to hand. People are discussing the latest political news, scientific discoveries, and literary publications. This scene would have been impossible in 1400. The combination of affordable printed materials and public gathering places created a new kind of public sphere. People who were not aristocrats or clergy could participate in intellectual and political discussions. Ideas could be debated openly. Public opinion became a force that governments had to consider. This is the foundation of modern democracy. Democracy requires informed citizens who can read about issues, discuss them, and make decisions. The printing press created the possibility of an informed public. It's no coincidence that the rise of printing coincided with the rise of democratic ideas. Let's also consider the economic impact of printing. The printing industry created thousands of jobs. Printers, typesetters, ink makers, paper makers, bookbinders, booksellers, and distributors all found employment. Printing became one of the first modern industries, with specialized workers and efficient production methods. The book trade created international business networks. Books printed in Venice were sold in London. Books printed in Paris were sold in Amsterdam. This trade spread ideas but also created economic connections between cities and countries. Merchants who traded in books often traded in other goods too. Printing also changed how people thought about intellectual property and copyright. When books were hand-copied, the idea of owning the rights to a text was unclear. But when printers invested money in setting type and printing thousands of copies, they wanted protection from competitors who might copy their work. This led to the development of copyright laws, which try to balance authors' rights with the public's access to knowledge. Now I want to tell you about some of the beautiful books that early printers created. They didn't just see printing as a way to make cheap books. Many printers were artists who wanted to create beautiful objects. The Gutenberg Bible itself is a masterpiece. The pages have perfect proportions. The letters are elegant. Many copies were decorated with gold leaf and hand-painted illustrations. In Venice, a printer named Aldus Manutius invented italic type in 1501. He also created small, portable books that people could carry in their pockets. Before this, most books were large and heavy, meant to sit on lecterns. Aldus's pocket books made reading a portable, personal activity. You could read while traveling or sitting in a garden. In the Netherlands, printers created beautiful illustrated books. They combined printing with woodcut and engraving techniques to create images. Scientific books showed detailed pictures of plants, animals, and human anatomy. Geography books showed maps of newly discovered lands. These illustrations made books more useful and more beautiful. The printing press also changed how authors thought about their work. Before printing, an author might write a book and give it to a patron or a monastery. The author had little control over who read it or how it was copied. But with printing, authors could work with printers to publish their work for a wide audience. This created the idea of the professional author who writes for a living. William Shakespeare, who lived from 1564 to 1616, benefited from printing. His plays were performed in theaters, but they were also printed in small books called quartos. People who couldn't attend the theater could read the plays. This helped make Shakespeare famous beyond London. Today we know his work because printed copies survived. Let's think about how the printing press affected ordinary people's daily lives. A merchant in 1600 could buy a printed almanac that told him when to plant crops, when religious festivals occurred, and when markets would be held. A housewife could buy a printed recipe book with instructions for cooking and making medicines. A craftsman could buy a printed manual showing techniques for his trade. Printed calendars, maps, and instruction books made life more predictable and manageable. Knowledge that had been passed down orally or learned through apprenticeship could now be written down and consulted. This made it easier for people to learn new skills and plan their activities. Children's lives changed too. Before printing, most children learned by watching their parents work and listening to stories. But with printed books, children could learn to read using primers and textbooks. Schools could teach more children because books were available. This opened opportunities for children from ordinary families to become educated and pursue careers that required literacy. Religious life changed dramatically. We've talked about the Protestant Reformation, but printing affected Catholic life too. Printed prayer books, saints' lives, and devotional texts allowed ordinary Catholics to have richer private religious lives. They didn't have to rely only on church services. They could read and pray at home. Printed books of hours, which contained prayers for different times of day, became very popular. These books were often beautifully illustrated and were treasured possessions. They show how printing could make religious practice more personal and individual. The printing press also spread knowledge about the wider world. When European explorers sailed to the Americas, Asia, and Africa, they wrote accounts of what they saw. These accounts were printed and became bestsellers. Europeans read about strange animals, unfamiliar plants, different cultures, and new lands. This expanded their mental horizons and fed curiosity about the world. Some of these accounts were accurate, but many were filled with exaggerations and fantasies. Printers knew that sensational stories sold well. This created a problem that still exists today: how do we distinguish reliable information from sensationalism? The printing press gave us access to more information, but it also required us to become more critical readers. Let me tell you about the printing of maps. Before printing, maps were rare and expensive. Sailors and merchants guarded them carefully because they contained valuable information about trade routes and navigation. But printed maps made geographic knowledge widely available. An educated person in 1600 could buy a printed atlas and see maps of the entire known world. This had practical and psychological effects. Practically, it made travel and trade easier. Psychologically, it changed how people understood their place in the world. They could see that their town or country was just one small part of a much larger world. This perspective was both humbling and exciting. The scientific revolution of the 1600s and 1700s would have been impossible without the printing press. Scientists like Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, and Anton van Leeuwenhoek published detailed descriptions of their experiments. Other scientists could read these descriptions, repeat the experiments, and verify or challenge the results. This process of publication, replication, and peer review is the foundation of modern science. Scientific journals began to be published in the mid-1600s. The Royal Society of London published Philosophical Transactions, starting in 1665. This journal allowed scientists to share new discoveries quickly with colleagues across Europe. The speed of scientific communication increased dramatically. A discovery made in London could be known in Paris or Rome within weeks instead of years. Let's also consider how printing changed entertainment and leisure. Before printing, people entertained themselves with oral storytelling, music, and games. But printed books added a new form of entertainment, reading for pleasure. Novels, poetry, plays, and adventure stories became available to anyone who could read. This created a new kind of private experience. Reading is a solitary activity. When you read a novel, you enter an imaginary world in your mind. This is different from watching a play or listening to a storyteller, which are social activities. Printing made it possible for people to have rich inner lives shaped by the books they read. The novel as a literary form developed alongside printing. Long, complex stories with developed characters and intricate plots became possible because readers could take their time, read at their own pace, and even reread difficult passages. Novels like Don Quixote, by Cervantes, published in 1605, showed what this new form could achieve. Printing also preserved minority languages and cultures. When a language is only spoken, it can disappear when its speakers die or adopt a different language. But when a language is printed in books, it has a better chance of survival. Grammars and dictionaries of smaller languages were printed, helping to preserve them for future generations. However, printing also contributed to the dominance of major languages. Books in English, French, Spanish, and German were profitable because many people could read these languages. Books in smaller languages were less profitable and therefore less common. This economic reality meant that major languages spread while some minor languages declined. Now let's jump forward to the 1800s and see the next phase of the printing revolution. The Industrial Revolution brought steam power and mechanization to printing. The printing press that Gutenberg would have recognized was replaced by steam-powered presses that could print thousands of pages per hour. Papermaking became mechanized too, making paper much cheaper. These improvements made newspapers and magazines extremely cheap. By the mid-1800s, a working person could afford to buy a daily newspaper. Mass literacy combined with cheap print created mass media. Newspapers became powerful political forces. They could shape public opinion, expose corruption, and advocate for causes. The rise of mass media in the 1800s reminds us of the rise of social media in our own time. Both created new ways for information to spread quickly to large audiences. Both gave voice to people who previously had no public platform. Both created new problems of misinformation and manipulation. The pattern that Gutenberg started continues to evolve. In the 1900s, new technologies challenged printing. Radio brought news and entertainment into homes without requiring literacy. Television added moving images. Computers and the internet created digital text that didn't need paper or ink. Some people predicted that printed books would disappear. But books have survived. Many people still prefer reading physical books to reading on screens. There's something satisfying about the weight of a book in your hands, the smell of paper, the ability to flip through pages. Bookstores and libraries remain important community spaces. The printed book, Gutenberg's invention, has proven remarkably resilient. However, the basic principle that Gutenberg demonstrated, that information wants to spread, that people hunger for knowledge, that technology can democratize access to ideas, this principle is more relevant than ever. The Internet is sometimes called the printing press of our age. It makes information available to billions of people. It allows anyone to publish their thoughts. It breaks down barriers between experts and amateurs. Like the printing press, the Internet creates both opportunities and challenges. It spreads knowledge but also misinformation. It connects people but also creates echo chambers where people only hear opinions they already agree with. It democratizes publishing but also makes it harder to distinguish reliable sources from unreliable ones. So what can we learn from the story of the printing press? First, we learn that technology is not neutral. The printing press was just a machine, but it changed religion, politics, science, education, and culture. The people who controlled printing had power. The people who could read had advantages. Technology shapes society in profound ways. Second, we learn that information is powerful. The printing press gave more people access to information, and this changed the balance of power in society. Knowledge that had been controlled by elites became available to ordinary people. This pattern continues today. Access to information remains a key factor in equality and opportunity. Third, we learn that change is often resisted. The printing press threatened the power of the church and the aristocracy. They tried to control it through censorship and licensing. But the technology was too useful and spread too quickly to be fully controlled. When a technology meets a real human need, it's very difficult to stop it. Fourth, we learn that new technologies create new problems even as they solve old ones. The printing press solved the problem of book scarcity but created the problem of information overload. It solved the problem of knowledge preservation but created the problem of copyright and intellectual property. Every solution brings new challenges. Fifth, we learn that human curiosity and the desire to share knowledge are fundamental parts of human nature. Gutenberg wasn't forced to invent the printing press. He was driven by a vision of making books available to more people. The printers who spread his invention across Europe were motivated by profit, yes, but also by the excitement of being part of something revolutionary. When we look at Johannes Gutenberg's life, we see both success and failure. He invented something that changed the world, but he died relatively poor and unrecognized. He lost his business in a lawsuit. He never got to see the full impact of his invention. This reminds us that the people who create transformative technologies don't always benefit from them personally. Yet Gutenberg's legacy is immense. Every book you've ever read, every newspaper, every magazine, every pamphlet exists because of the principles he established. The idea that knowledge should be accessible, that information can be mass-produced, that reading is a right not a privilege, these ideas flow from Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz. Today, we live in a world that Gutenberg helped create. We take for granted that we can walk into a library and borrow books for free. We assume that children will learn to read in school. We expect that scientific knowledge will be published and shared. We believe that people have the right to read different opinions and make up their own minds. None of this was obvious in 1440. The printing press teaches us about human nature in several ways. It shows our hunger for knowledge and stories. It shows our desire to communicate across time and space. It shows our ability to create tools that amplify our capabilities. It shows both our best qualities, curiosity, creativity, generosity, and our worst, the spread of hatred, the manipulation of truth, the concentration of power. Most importantly, the story of the printing press teaches us that ideas matter. Physical force, wealth, and political power are important, but ideas shape how people understand the world and what they believe is possible. The printing press was powerful because it spread ideas. Those ideas changed what people believed about religion, government, science, and themselves. As you go about your day, surrounded by printed words and digital text, remember Johannes Gutenberg in his workshop, pulling that heavy wooden handle, watching the first clear letters appear on white paper. Remember the monks who lost their jobs copying manuscripts. Remember Martin Luther's theses spreading across Germany. Remember the first child who owned their own book. The revolution that began in that workshop in Mainz continues today. Every time you share an idea, every time you question authority, every time you learn something new from a book or a screen, you are participating in the revolution that Gutenberg started. Information wants to be free. Knowledge wants to spread. And human beings, curious and creative, will always find new ways to share what they know with others. This is what the printing press teaches us about being human. We are creatures who learn, who question, who share, who build on what came before. We are not content to accept the world as it is. We imagine how it could be different. And sometimes, like Gutenberg, we create something that helps make that different world possible. That capacity for transformation, that hope for a better future through knowledge and communication, is one of the most beautiful aspects of human nature.